Sound matters. Be heard. Welcome to the podcast where you get exclusive behind-the-scenes tips to make your own show sound truly spectacular. This is Podtastic Audio.
Hey, what's happening? How are you doing today? I want to say thank you so much for being here. My name is Chris, and I am from the original Chris and Christine Show podcast. You can find out every single thing about that show at the little website, which I built at chrisandchristineshow.com. Very simple. There's a link to it in the show notes of this episode. But here is Podtastic Audio, where I help you create and design a better podcast experience for your audience, which is really what the show should be about in the first place. So here on Podtastic Audio today, we're going to talk about the biggest new thing that happened to podcasting since Apple got in the game back in 2005 with their iPod. And I think they even coined the word podcast because it was like a broadcast mixing with the word iPod. And that's how the term podcast came about. But if you have not known that Apple, they always like to announce a brand new iPhone right around this time of year. And they just did iPhone 15, which is probably going to be my upgrade because I have an iPhone 11 and it's getting awfully hot in my pocket sometimes when the battery, I don't know, I think it's showing its age, although it does work fairly well. It's got a very quick processor chip in there. I think it's when they first decided to use these new line of processors. My phone was one of the early ones that had it, and it's pretty quick and it holds up. But the battery's starting to show its age, starting to die. I notice now that if you go into the iPhone settings, it says that my phone can only go up to 85% capacity is all my phone can physically do. Hence, I'm actually having to charge the thing more often than not. So sometime soon, I'll upgrade to probably the iPhone 15 whenever I get a chance to do that. But one of the coolest things about being an iPhone owner is that they have these iOS updates. iOS stands for their operating system they have on the iPhone platforms and the iPad platforms, which kind of share the same thing. But anyways, iOS 17 just got released. I have downloaded it to my phone. And one of the coolest things about iOS 17 is that they totally redesigned Apple Podcasts on the podcast player. Now, if you're not familiar with Apple Podcasts, you should be, because Apple Podcasts happen to be the biggest, or one of the biggest, it's up to debate, but I think it's the biggest podcast platform out there. If you have a chance to get your show onto Apple Podcasts, I would highly do it. If you're going to do like one or maybe even two platforms, and that's it, at least make one of those platforms Apple Podcasts. Because not only is your show in Apple, it will be in a bunch of other podcasts out there. I'm talking, there's like 150. I don't know them. I don't have them listed in front of me, but there's a lot of other platforms that actually will pull all the content and data from Apple directly out of the Apple, catalog to put in their own podcast players. They kind of are built on the Apple Podcast platform. So Apple Podcast sits on top of these other little smaller independent, small time little podcast players will all pull all the content and data right out of Apple. So your show not only is it in Apple, it will be in 150 other players that you don't even are aware that even exist. Yeah, so we know that Apple holds probably 40 to 60% of the market share when it comes to listening to podcasts. I listen to all my podcasts on Apple Podcasts, and I've always done that unless for some reason a show is going to be exclusively Spotify or iHeartRadio or something like that. I'm like, oh, come on. Can't you just be on Apple like everybody else? Why gotta be so difficult? So then I might check out that show on the other platform. But for the most part, if your show is not inside Apple Podcasts, there's a good chance I'm not listening to it. I like to keep it simple. It works very well. I like the way it works. Some people hate the way it works. Some people don't like Apple Podcasts. I absolutely love it. It's simple. It's on my phone. It's on my computer. It updates automatically. Everything looks great. And now with the brand new iOS 17, they've changed it to where you physically can now, for the first time ever, you can see episode artwork on Apple Podcasts, individual episode artwork for each episode, not just only the graphic artwork that you might have for the show itself, but you can now, if you create episode artwork for each and every episode, it will show it in the Apple Podcast player. And also, this also works for Apple CarPlay because I have Apple CarPlay also, and you can also see the updated artwork there too. It looks very pretty. I like the way it looks. It looks different than some of the other ones you may have seen. Like I know Spotify has been doing this for years. They've always have shown the episode artwork on their podcast player. And I think the same thing goes for Amazon. And there's a few others also. And for some reason, everyone's like, why isn't Apple actually doing this? Because Apple's like the big guy in the block. It's so simple to do. And I can see why now, after they changed some things and made a few rules and regulations on how they want their whole podcast app to look, that is why they decided to hold back on perhaps putting in episode artwork into their podcast player. Now you're probably thinking, hey, Chris, dude, I don't even have an iPhone. I use a Samsung or something else, and I listen to everything on Spotify or whatever player you use. I don't even care about Apple stuff. Why do I care? Well, your listeners might. And the show that you're creating, it's for your listeners. And your listeners to your show, there's a good chance, probably a 60% chance, they're listening to it on a iOS, iPhone/iPad device. Now, although this is an audio podcast, you can't physically see what I'm doing here. I'm going to try my best to try to explain what Apple wants the new artwork to look like, their requirements for new episode artwork, and I'll try to explain the best I can on how the actual image is supposed to look like and where the user interface graphics from Apple are going to be placed on your episode artwork. So they kind of tell you in detail and give examples here of what the actual image should look like and where to kind of keep stuff off the image, because Apple's going to use that real estate, that space on your image, so Apple can put their graphic interface right on top of it. Now, this is coming directly from podcasters.apple.com. This is Apple Podcasts for creators. It's their rules and guidelines on how to create episode artwork, show artwork, subscriptions, all that wonderful stuff. But today we're going to talk about creating episode artwork that's individual, separate from your actual show artwork. Now, your show artwork is the artwork that everybody sees when they're scrolling through a list of all of the podcasts in your niche, in your category. Your show might pop up, and the very first thing that anybody's going to see is your artwork. And some would say, and I'm probably guilty of this myself, is that you will judge them based solely on the artwork, whether or not you're going to press play on that podcast show. Now, it's kind of like judging a book by its cover. We're all guilty of it. It's the same thing with movies or movie posters. If you go to a theater and you see a couple of movie posters and you have no idea what the movie's about, you have no idea. You're just looking at it and you're like, well, that movie poster looks kind of cool. That's kind of a movie that I might want to go check out. And you go check it out. It's the same thing with a book or maybe even a magazine. You see the cover of it, you're like, oh, the cover looks kind of interesting. I kind of like that. And the same thing goes for audio podcasts or maybe even YouTube videos. That's a whole different thing. But YouTube videos uses thumbnails to capture your attention to want to press play on that particular video. That's why most YouTube creators will spend hours and all kinds of time and figuring out how to get the best looking YouTube thumbnail for their goofy little video they're making, because they want the attention to be drawn to theirs over all the other shows in the column that you're scrolling through. They want their show to stand out. And the same thing goes for your podcast show artwork. Now, since we're talking about show cover artwork, I'm going to go over their rules very briefly here. It says the show cover, a successful show cover, makes a visual impact and immediately draws the listeners with simplicity and legibility. This artwork is required. Remember, the show artwork is required of all podcasting, no matter where you put your podcast at, but especially with Apple, they absolutely require you to have at the minimum, show artwork, which should contain your logo, your show name, and key art. This can be anything you want. A picture you took, a regular background. If you've been podcasting for a little while, you at least know what show artwork is. And I made the mistake in the very early days of Podtastic Audio where I was not impressed with my show artwork. It looked very low quality. It was red, kind of a light red on a black background, which blended in. The font blended in. You can barely read it. And I didn't like it. So I completely overhauled it and changed it to what I have today, which is white lettering on a black background, which you can totally see a lot better. And the dimensions for your Apple Podcast show artwork has to be a square with a maximum of 3,000 by 3,000 pixels or a minimum of 1,400 by 1,400 pixels. And it says the largest size is preferred. So they're saying you probably should go. I mean, I got mine at 3,000 by 3,000. And if you need help creating show artwork for your podcast, what I have done with this show is I have used the free CANVA account. You go to canva.com. I'll put a link to it in the show notes, and you can create yourself a free Canva account. Now I have the paid version, but the free version will get you a lot of cool tools where you can create podcast artwork, and you can size it accordingly to the 3,000 by 3,000, which Apple wants you to do. You can do it right then and there. You can drop in your own photos and things like that right into Canva. There's lots of different fonts and lots of different tools and lots of different elements you can use, even on the free plan, that you can create amazing podcast artwork for yourself for free. Or if you don't want to do that, you always can hire somebody to do podcast artwork for you. But it's really up to you. If you want to save some money, play around with the free Canva account and see what you can do. Now, that is the regular artwork, but it's not required, but you can create individual episode artwork. That means each episode that you create, not only do you upload the audio file to your media host, you also upload the new graphic artwork for that episode. I've been doing this for a very long time. I actually figured this out on the Chris Christine show. I figured this out probably, I don't know, maybe like the 5th episode in or 7th episode in. I realized, wait a second, you can change the artwork for each episode and it kind of shows something different. And then I realized that when I was listening to it on Spotify in my truck with the Apple CarPlay, I realized a long time ago, I was like, wait a second, I actually can see the graphic artwork which I created for that own episode. I actually can see it on the screen in my truck. That is super, super cool. So I was like, wow, that's amazing. Then I realized, wait a second, it doesn't work with Apple? Why doesn't it work with Apple? Only with Spotify. I noticed that, and it was super cool, but that alone was not going to get me to only listen to things on Spotify. So how does one go about creating episode artwork if they've already created their show artwork? Like, you've already got the amazing show artwork, so what would be put in the actual episode artwork? What would it even be? Well, that kind of depends on you. You see, your episode artwork should probably have something about the episode in the artwork. I've been keeping it kind of simple for the most part. I use a couple apps on my iPhone. Although I probably can do this on Canva, but I just do it on my iPhone because I can do it kind of like anywhere, like from the couch or out somewhere else. I can physically pull up my iPhone and create the artwork for an episode right there in my hand. It makes it very simple, very portable, I guess. So what you can do is, what I have done with these apps I have, I create a square block to kind of start putting things on, start stacking things on. Now, usually the square block is some kind of color pattern of something I have. It's all part of the app I have. So I create it as a square. It's usually about 2,800 by 2,800 pixels, which is pretty good. Then I start to overlay different graphics. And one of the graphics I like to put on here is my actual show artwork. And then I'll insert something like that episode number somewhere on the graphic. And then if I have a guest, I'll put them somewhere on the graphic, an image of them, and then maybe a description what the show is about somewhere at the bottom or somewhere like that. Now, that's how I do it. I save that as its own unique file somewhere on the computer, somewhere on my phone. I got it saved. So when I do upload the episode, I send that in with the show MP3 file, and it goes to the media host. And then through the magic of RSS, it gets sent out to all the cool podcast players. Now, according to Apple, here are their list, their set of instructions on how they want you, if you are creating episode artwork. This is the rules that Apple says for their brand new iOS 17 update with Apple Podcasts. They say, episode artwork appears in iOS devices with iOS 17 or later on the now playing screen and the queue, the lock screen, the control center, in up next, on listen now, on show and episode pages, and through link previews in other apps, including messages, mail, and on social media platforms. This artwork is optional, but is a great way to highlight the episode's content or guests while drawing in listeners with additional visual interest. When episode artwork is not supplied, Apple Podcasts will continue to display show artwork. Apple Podcasts will also default to show artwork when multiple shows are presented together to help orient listeners. Creators can publish episode artwork via RSS using their third-party hosting provider, which, for the record, is the only way that I have always done it. I've always included my episode artwork at the time of uploading the episode to the podcast host. That's the way I've always done it. There's other ways you can do it too. Some would actually include it with a metadata, but according to Apple, they're saying it probably needs to be used through the RSS feed. Now, here is the guidelines on what the actual artwork should be. Here we go. It says, fill the entire template with art. Give your episode artwork a distinct visual branding separate from your show and channel artwork. Do not use your show cover as episode art. Episode titles are displayed in the UI under the artwork, so avoid repeating the episode title in the episode art. The episode art and show art are often displayed together so listeners can see which show published the episode. Keep all essential design elements within the art-safe area. Anything placed outside the art-safe area is subject to cropping and or UI overlays. Avoid placing essential design elements where the safe area and UI areas intersect. Note that the UI text color will default to white. Use a background color that allows white UI text to be legible. Now, I know that might sound complicated because I'm not physically showing you something on the screen, and this text doesn't really show you anything either. But they do have some samples of what they're talking about, and actually having used the brand new Apple Podcast iOS 17 on my iPhone, I kind of get the idea of what they're actually talking about. So you cannot see this, but pulled up right in front of me is I have an image that is from Apple that basically has a blocked off square image where it has some areas on the bottom left and the bottom kind of in one color. In the middle and top left, it has another color. Basically, they're calling this the green area. They're calling this a podcast episode template, basically meaning that your new episode artwork should kind of fill in this area on the screen. Yeah, I know it's very hard to explain this over audio, but basically imagine a square. You're looking right at a square because that's your image is going to be. On the bottom, like maybe the bottom quarter, bottom 25% of the screen and up a little bit. If you're looking at looks like a Tetris brick, like the L Tetris brick that you kind of like would twist sideways a little bit and fill in the bottom. That's kind of what it looks like. So that section on the bottom here, probably 25, maybe 20% or so at the very bottom. That's the area where they're saying that we are going to cover it up with our graphics that are going to be in white, displaying either your show, the title of your show, the episode number. There's going to be a graphic interface right above that. So chances are, if you have anything important on the bottom part of the episode image, no one's going to see it, at least not on the front screen. They may see it when they click on the actual episode, and then you only have the episode in front of you. You're probably going to see it, but anywhere else, you may not see that. So if you have anything important, you want to keep it towards the middle of the image or the top left. Now, towards the top left, it looks like they give you more real estate because it goes all the way to the top of the square, down to the halfway part, and then all the way over. And that area seems to be the area they give you. So middle of the image, top left, if you have anything important, perhaps the guest name or an image about something, it's all kind of going to go right there in the middle of the screen. Now, this really comes in handy if, say, you have an important VIP guest on your show. If you're doing guest interviews of any kind, that perhaps maybe taking the guest image and putting it right there and make the guest image the episode artwork. That's all you really have to do. And you put it on there so that when someone's scrolling through their phone on Apple Podcasts and they see, oh, what do I want to listen to of all the shows I subscribe to, without actually having to read, episode whatever, talk to so-and-so, whatever, they can see the picture of the person and it's right there in the episode artwork for you to see. You're like, oh yeah, I want to see that person. Oh yeah, I want to hear what they had to say. I know that person. It might help, maybe, I'm saying it might help actually generate traffic to your show. It might actually generate more listeners to your show. And all of this is completely optional. You do not have to do any of this stuff, but you do have to have regular show artwork. And if you decide not to, create individual episode artwork, then your regular show artwork will be put in place right there in the middle. And you can tell the difference between a podcast that has created actual episode artwork versus a show that has just the show artwork. Because when you look at it on Apple Podcasts, the podcasts that only have the show artwork, it'll be, obviously their show artwork will be right there, dead center in the screen, in the little box. Now, if you have episode artwork, that entire box is filled with your show episode artwork. And that is what they're talking about, because the graphic interface actually covers some of that stuff up. And on the bottom left of that little graphic interface, you see your actual real show artwork will be there. It's super tiny. It's like a little tiny little speck on the bottom left corner of that square. So if you think about it, that bottom left square is being taken up by your actual regular artwork. And on the bottom middle, it looks like it's a solid color with white text of the description of your show. So whatever your show's title is, it's written in that little text block area, and the actual block itself, at least on our show we just uploaded today, it actually kind of mirrors some of the colors in the actual image itself. So it's very slick. It looks very well done. And I know that on another show that I'm listening to, which has a green background, their bottom text area is green. So it looks like the actual bottom text block area that covers the bottom section of the image is whichever color or colors is in the actual image itself. Like we used some blue and gray, and it looks like the bottom section was actually gray, and the white lettering on top of it, which is actually just the title of the episode, is written there right in white, and it has a small text below that, which is the first line of our actual show notes. So it puts a little bit of text right in there. So if you've got a really short show title, it's going to be about 4 or 5 lines of text right below where the actual artwork ends and the text box begins. And in that text box, that's where it actually has the show title and a little bit of description right in there. And it looks very, very slick. Now, this is only for Apple Podcasts. And if you do not care about Apple Podcasts, don't worry about it. But there's a good chance that your listeners do. And there's a good chance they have an iPhone or an iOS device. And I just updated to iOS 17. I know that not everybody, updates to the latest and greatest every time. I like to do it because I always figure, why not have the best while I can? If If there's a bug that needs to be fixed, Apple's very quick on putting out new updates. In fact, as I recorded this, iOS 17 came out and they already had updated to a 17.01. They've already updated it already. Something about a security threat? I don't know. Listen, they're on top of these things, so they're pretty quick about getting new updates out, and they're available to anybody who has an iPhone. I think going back to iPhone 10, maybe 11. I don't know. I think maybe I got the cutoff for how old an iPhone can be and still run iOS 17. There's a list on Apple's website or somewhere I saw it, something like that. And your phone will tell you. You go into settings, you click on updates available, and if it's not showing any updates available and you have an older iPhone, well, there's two things you can do. You can not worry about it, or you can take your phone in and get a new one. But creating episode artwork is entirely up to you. It's entirely optional, but it does make things look much prettier for your podcast audience. Remember, they're going to see you before they press play and hear you. Hey, thanks again for listening. I am also on social media. Yeah, check that out. You can find me on Twitter on Podtastic A. And if you go over to the gram, that is the Instagram, you can find me under Podtastic Audio. Very simple. Give me a follow, give me a like, and so I will catch you on the next episode.